This is a recorded session, so please keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. We may call upon members of the audience to comment, but the best way is just put your thoughts in the chat box, and we'll go through them as they come through. And there's a CME code for all our Cleveland Clinic providers. Okay, so let's just review what we have discussed so far. We talked about what is a mode of mechanical ventilation, and essentially it's a predetermined pattern of interaction between a patient and a ventilator, and it's a combination of three things: the control variable, the breath sequence, and the targeting scheme, and these three together create a mode. To summarize it and to be able to convey what a mode does rapidly, there is this item that we call a tag, or taxonomic attribution group. Essentially, this tag summarizes the control variable on the first letters. Then the next letters, the next set of letters is the breath sequence, and the final set of letters is the targeting scheme. And the targeting scheme is usually one letter when it's just mandatory breaths or just spontaneous breaths, and that refers to but if there's two types of breaths, for example in IMB, where there's mandatory and spontaneous, the first one by convention is going to be the mandatory breath, and the second one is going to be the targeting scheme from the spontaneous breath. So we're going to just review rapidly that in terms of the breath control variable. So the first variable in your tag, there can only be pressure or volume. And this is based on that you can only control one side of the equation of motion. So either you control the pressure or you control the flow, and by consequence, the volume. Historically, we have called it volume controlled, although what we're controlling is actually the flow. And we reviewed in our prior VentRounds that when you're controlling the flow, we call it volume control. And actually, if your eyes should always be going towards the flow waveform. That's actually the easiest way to recognize this. And you're most likely to see features on that waveform of flow control, which is a geometric shape. So either a square waveform or a descending waveform. Although there is some other modes that can control and generate different waveforms, this is the easiest tell. The second one is that if there is evidence of effort, you will see the changes not on the flow or the volume, because that's controlled, but you would see them on the pressure waveform. And if you're controlling the pressure, you're going to see this waveform that is controlled by the device, but the flow and the volume will change according to the respiratory system characteristics or effort. Rob has posted the taxonomy paper that actually explains all of this on the chat for you to visit. The second item, and we spoke about this on the prior VentRounds, is the breath sequence, and there's essentially three sequences: CMV, IMV, and CSV. And this refers that there's only two types of breath for the taxonomy purpose. One is spontaneous, the other one is mandatory. And for you to remember, this is relatively easy. If it's the breath is triggered and cycled by the patient, meaning the patient retains control over the timing of the breath, then it's a spontaneous breath. And if it's the patient or the machine triggers or cycles the breath, meaning the patient can trigger it, but the machine cycles or ends the breath, then the patient loses control over the timing of the breath, and that makes it a mandatory breath. And that's an easy way to understand this. Just remember, spontaneous, you control both. The patient controls the trigger and the cycle, and if not, the machine, i.e. the ventilator, controls either the start or the end of the breath. And that gives you five sequences. You will note that there is no volume controlled CSV, and that is because if you're controlling the flow, you're controlling the size of the breath and the timing, and so for that reason, that cannot exist. And so there's only five basic ventilator patterns: CMV, IMV, volume control or pressure control with the three variations. And so with that, we come to the last part of the tag, which is essentially the targeting scheme. And the targeting scheme is simply the way that the ventilator controls the interaction with the patient. So, and it gives a specific ventilatory pattern. These became more complex and with more variations once we had the ability to put computers on the ventilator. So in a way, the way that it makes it easier for me to understand is that this is the programming that exists on the ventilator to how to control the hardware in the interaction with the patient. And so the operator is setting programming the ventilator, and that software controls the hardware, and that interacts with the patient. And so this relationship and the way that we program is what we call a targeting scheme. Rob?
Yeah, that's pretty complicated. I'm going to post a paper that talks about closed loop control in general, if people want to look deeper into it.
And so essentially you can imagine that the way that you can program the ventilator, it's endless. There's actually multiple ways that you can, and very many differences that can make it really hard to understand what actually the ventilators do. But on that paper that Rob is posting, essentially, we ended up with 7 different ways to program the ventilator, or 7 targeting schemes. Now, like anything, these things, there can be others that are being developed. But this is at that time, and at the current time, the 7 that were described. And there's different different ways to memorize this, but I think that going over them is probably the easiest for all of you. And you'll see here a way that we have divided them or subdivided them. But this is mainly for you to try to understand that there's targeting schemes in which you essentially are going to put most of the values of what you want the ventilator to do. And so we call that kind of basic, essentially set point, where you set everything on the ventilator. You tell the ventilator the total volume, or you tell the patient the pressure that it's going to deliver. And this is basically the most simple types of modes that we have available at this time. There's dual, which we're going to talk about today, in which the ventilator switches from volume control to pressure control during the breath, not in between. So while the inspiration is happening, the ventilator changes either from volume control to pressure control, or from pressure control to volume control. And it's also relatively simple algorithms that control this. Then there's semi-automatic, so in which there's more that the ventilator does on its own. And here we placed biovariable, in which the ventilator randomly changes the inspiratory pressure. Servo, where the ventilator delivers proportional to the effort of the patient. Adaptive, when the ventilator adjusts the values to reach a target. So for example, reaching tidal volume, it will adjust the inspiratory pressure to reach that volume. And then optimal, where the ventilator will continue to adjust ventilator settings to reach maximize or minimize a parameter. So optimizing the settings to reach to that level. And finally, automatic, where essentially you connect the patient to the ventilator, you enter very few variables, and the ventilator uses tools from artificial intelligence to control most of the settings on the ventilator. And so you can see that from basic, where there's a lot of involvement of the operator, all the way to automatic, we have those available out there. Rob?
Just to say that the direction of evolution of modes is going the direction of everything else. Artificial intelligence is going to take over everything. It'll select the targets, and it'll select the settings to optimize those targets.
And the key here to understand this and why is this so relevant for you as a clinician is that each one of these tools, each one of these targeting schemes has certain patients in which will be better for certain patients. And you need to understand what it does and interacts with the patient so that you can titrate and adjust as needed any of this, including the intelligent. I would say you need to understand what it actually does and in which circumstances it will make more sense than in others. Alrighty. So that was our ultra fast introduction into the tag. I will just highlight for you that when we talk about the tag, first you're going to say the control variable, then the breath sequence, and finally the targeting scheme. And if this is an IMB sequence, the first letter is the targeting scheme from the mandatory breath, and the second one is for the spontaneous breath. Now, you'll see that we have now added a parenthesis right here. So now we usually, if we are writing PC IMB, we will put a parenthesis here with a number, and then we'll put the targeting scheme over here. And that refers to the different types of IMB that exist. There's 4 types that we reviewed last SEVA VentRounds. So we're not going to go over them right now, but we will touch on them as we're presenting some targeting schemes. Alrighty, so let's start with this one, and I'll tell you that in this ventilator, this mode is called volume control. So I'll give you that so that you imagine that you come to the bedside and you see that the ventilator is called volume control. So I would ask the people that are attending right now to enter on the chat, what is the tag for this mode? So how would you describe it? And have no fear. This is the moment in which you put whatever you think, and we'll analyze it here. Very good. I see someone entering. Very good. So in general, the majority of you are talking about volume control, CMB, S, and that is correct. That is correct. At least on this image that we're showing right here, where there is no evidence of respiratory effort by the patient. So the breath is mandatory. Each one of them, you can see that it's not targeted by the patient. So immediately all the breaths become mandatory. We also see the classic waveform that we would see on volume control, in which there with square waveform, in which we see a rapid rise on the pressure waveform and a constant, although this patient has some other issues, but a constant rise on pressure, and then the breath ends. And the flow is constant throughout the inspiration. Again, this ventilator shows a little bit of irregularity in the waveform, and that is related to the way that it's programmed to display the flow waveform, but in reality it's a square waveform. And one thing that you learn to read waveforms is that you're going to see a lot of little disturbances, and you have to see through them. But essentially, this is a constant flow, so this is volume control appropriately. All the breaths are mandatory because the machine is triggering all the breaths, so immediately all of them are mandatory. And then in terms of set point, you all set the tidal volume, you set the I time or the flow, you set the respiratory rate, you set the PEEP, and you set the rise time. In this case, there is no rise time. So those are the things that you would set. Then because you're controlling all of these things, you're setting the points, or this is set point targeting, and so you control everything. Rob?
Just to say that all ventilators have very different and unique looking operator interfaces. They have different colors for the waveforms. They show where the patient trigger on pressure or flow in different ways, and you will get to recognize that. We have, what do we have? We have basically like four major platforms at the Cleveland Clinic, and a bunch of other ones that have to do with home care ventilators and things like that. But all this stuff will become like looking at a roadmap.
Very good. So remember, set point means you set all the targeting points, so everything that the machine is going to be going after. All right, here I put another example. This is a classic ventilator that we use, the Servo U, and up here you can see the mode as it's written in the as presented on the ventilator. It says PS, that stands for pressure support / CPAP. And so what would be the targeting scheme for this? Please enter it on the and Rob, we probably can post the app for the, there we have an app that you can download on your phone that has the ability to give you the tags for each mode for the different types of ventilators that you're using. So what's the tag for this mode? Enter it on the chat, please. Okay. Very good. So this is I see majority of all of you recognize this as pressure control. So we're controlling the pressure, even though you don't see. Remember that ventilators are mediocre controllers of pressure in general. They're very good at controlling flow. And usually when I try to figure out if it's pressure control or volume control, I go and look at the flow waveform, and immediately you can see that there is different configurations of the flow waveform. And it doesn't look geometric, and there's some variation on the tidal volume, if anything. But so this is pressure control. So the ventilator is trying to keep the pressure at a set number, and you can see here that the pressure support was set at 0, so and the PEEP was set at 5. So the ventilator is trying to keep, assuming this is probably the pressure where the ventilator, this is 5 centimeters of water. The ventilator is trying to keep the pressure at that level, and the patient is doing a lot of effort around it. And so you're going to see these ups and downs that you see right now as that happens. But all the breaths, this breath is started by the patient. So you see the drop in pressure and actually the change in color that tells me that the patient is triggering. The only one that knows that who is triggering is the ventilator, and to let you know that is happening, it's changing the color and saying, yep, this is a triggered breath. The patient is doing an effort there. And then the machine is trying to maintain the pressure there, and then the patient changes from inspiration to exhalation rapidly, and it's changing so fast that you're going to see this rise on pressure. That doesn't mean that there's a problem with cycling. It's just simply the ventilator is trying to maintain the pressure at 5, and the patient is changing rapidly from inspiration to exhalation. And when it changes, the pressure, the impedance increases and the pressure goes up. And so you see that that little, but the patient is finishing every single one of the breaths because of the type of ventilator that of the mode of how it's programmed. So it's all continuous spontaneous breaths. And then you set the pressure when the patient takes a breath. So the pressure support above PEEP was 0, and you set the PEEP. So you're setting all the values here. You set the inspiratory pressure and you set your PEEP. So essentially this is again set point, as you pointed out here. I would not go into the concept of assistance. Assistance doesn't help in classifying the breaths, but essentially the concept of assistance means that the ventilator is doing work on the patient, so it's helping while the patient is doing some effort. And you can imagine that if this is 5, there is some amount of help that the ventilator is generating here, but we're not going to get there at this time. Rob, comments?
Now, just to say that most ventilators, even though you set the pressure support above PEEP at 0, as you're showing here, they will deliver somewhere between 1 and 3 centimeters of water of inspiratory pressure support, which means that leaving somebody on a ventilator with 0 pressure support is not the same as putting them on a T-piece for a spontaneous breathing trial. We won't say more about that until later, but just so you know, it's not what you think it is.
Very good. Thank you, Roberto. And the Shravanti, you asked if this was R, which is servo. So we're going to see an example of it, but servo means that as the patient does more effort, the ventilator delivers more effort, and we'll see some examples here. Okay. All righty, here's another one, and again, this is the same mode as a minute ago. It's called volume control. All righty, and this is in a servo U. So and then here you have the waveforms for the patient. So what would be the tag for this? So remember, what's the breath control variable? What is the breath sequence? And what is the targeting scheme? All right, so I see you have identified that the control variable is volume control, and actually I would agree with you. So if you look at these breaths, there's something immediately atypical there, which is this little Humpty Dump that it's here, here, and here. But if we focus on the one that it's in the middle, this breath, which would be breath number 3, you can see that the flow is very well controlled by the machine. And actually, you will realize that in the other breaths, you can also see how the breath is controlled at certain times during the flow is controlled during the breath. So this is certainly volume control. That's how it starts. Now, if we see the breath sequence, the first thing that you're going to notice is this is a mandatory breath. A patient trigger breath. You can see that it's flow triggered, so there's the change in color. The next one is also patient triggered. You see the change in color there. This is also patient triggered. But this one over here is actually not patient triggered. The machine triggered this breath. There's no change in color in any of them, and there's no evidence of patient effort. Actually, if you compare this little divot here, it doesn't exist over here, and you can see it over here. So this is a machine triggered breath. The cycling, because the flow is controlled, so you can see the flow, then it ends the breath. This is a machine cycle breath. This is a machine cycle breath. You can see the flow was controlled. This was a machine cycle breath. And this one over here is actually a patient cycle breath. You can see the patient did an effort, and then eventually the breath cycled when the patient stopped doing the effort. So this is a good example for you to see that whenever there's either the trigger or the cycle or machine, that means that it's a mandatory breath. Now, this mode, this breath sequence, there's one breath that I didn't show over here. I mean, actually, this patient didn't have it. But if the patient had done, it's probably closer to this, a lot of effort, a larger effort, it would have cycled by the patient, and so this would have there's situations in which if the patient does enough effort under these circumstances, the breath actually becomes cycled by the patient, which makes this mode what we call IMV. The majority of the breaths are usual in this sequence. Actually, all the breaths in the sequence are mandatory, But we know for this mode, under these circumstances, there was a button that was pressed that's called flow adaptation, and it turns it from what you all called BCCMB to BCIMB, and this is a type 4, which Ariel put there. And what that means is that this only becomes a spontaneous mode when there is enough effort from the patient. So if the patient does a lot of effort, it will trigger and cycle the breath. And it can continue to do that as long as it has a lot of effort. So this is really a variation that exists in this ventilator in particular, not on everybody, all ventilators, which is an IMB type 4. And then the mandatory breath, the sequence for this one is actually dual. And for the spontaneous breath is dual, because it starts as you're trying to control the flow, and then it will change to controlling the pressure. So dual stands for, it starts as a mandatory volume control, and it's changing to pressure control because there's a lot of effort. So each one of these humps that you see here is a manifestation of the patient doing enough effort on this ventilator to change from volume control to pressure control. And it does that for the mandatory and the spontaneous breaths. And the importance of this, I mean, there's several items to think about that. The first one is, if you realize the inspiratory time for this breath is longer and this one is shorter, because the way that the ventilator is programmed is that when the patient gets the tidal volume that it's set, as you can see here, and the patient effort ends, the breath is going to become smaller to ensure that the patient gets the target tidal volume. But if the patient does a lot of effort, it will be able to get actually a larger tidal volume that you set. So these are things, nuances that I would say that you need to recognize on these modes as you're going through. Now, dual has different ways to present. This is one of them. And in other ventilators, it's going to be programmed in a different way. But you need to recognize that dual means that it starts volume and it changes to pressure. Rob?
Yeah, just to say that
Yeah.
this behavior is called fluid adaptation.
Yeah.
It is described in the operator's manual, and this is a servo U ventilator. The other thing to point out is that this is an option that is selected by the operator. Now, you can force this ventilator to do a constant inspiratory flow like you see on the third breath. And there's a little, when you select volume control, there are three little buttons, three little icons. And one icon looks like a constant flow. One icon looks like a constant flow with a hump, and that's your flow adaptation for dual targeting. And the other one is a ramp, which you'll find in other ventilators as well. So this behavior is totally under the control of the operator on this ventilator. On other ventilators, particularly older servo U's, this behavior was default and you couldn't change it. So it just depends on the software version that the ventilator has. The GE ventilators do something very similar as well, and that also is a default. You can't change it.
Very good. And finally, for today, I mean, there's many more that we can do, but let's take a look at this one. This mode is called PRVC. So the question for the team is, what is the targeting scheme here? And the tag. Very good. So I see the team has identified that this is pressure control, and you can actually see that the flow has the exponential decay. Actually, in this case, the patient probably has a very stiff lung, so it decays very rapidly. But it's not a square waveform or a triangular waveform or a sinusoidal waveform or an ascending waveform. It's the flow is not being controlled. It's dependent on the characteristics of the patient. And this is a common error because people see that you set the tidal volume, and the behavior is to say, "Ooh, this is volume control," but no, the 400 here is the target. And then the breath sequence, in this case, all of them are mandatory. Even though the first breath is patient trigger, all of them are being cycled by the ventilator. You can see that all the breaths have the same I time. So this is a CMB. And then the adaptive targeting, what adaptive, as you all recognize, means is the target in this case is 400. So you came to the bedside and said, I want 400, which is outlined by this line that we draw here. This is not present on the ventilator. And you can see that at the beginning, the breaths are being delivered by the device, and the volume is not reaching the target that you wanted. And so immediately what the ventilator realizes, the programming realizes, is the target tidal volume is not being achieved. So it starts increasing according to an algorithm, and every ventilator that has this adaptive targeting does it differently. But you can see that there's a hiking in the amount of pressure delivered, a hiking pressure delivered, a hiking pressure delivered, a hiking pressure delivered, until the target tidal volume is achieved. And at that point, the machine will continue to keep the pressure at that level to do that. So the device is adapting the inspiratory pressure to reach and achieve the target tidal volume that you have set. And I will stop there because it's 2:33. I'll see if there's any questions and answer. Rob, comment?
Oh, just to say that this is what you would see if there was an acute change in the patient's lung mechanics with either resistance going up or compliance going down.
Yeah, so if the patient, for example, here got a pneumothorax or a mucus plug, or somebody sat on their chest, or you laid them flat and they have a huge belly, the tidal volume will go down, and then boop, 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 the machine will start going up on the pressure. So there may not be any alarm that will come out as this is happening if you're not majorly out of range. All right, it's 2:34. We had a lot of other good ones. Again, please send us your images, your questions to either Twitter or to our CCF email, and I'll meet you all on G51 for in-person VentRounds. Thank you all. Have a good day.